The third and final pitch company, Parity Homes, is a real estate development company that focuses on development without displacement, and that was created out of a response to gentrification. Now, the one thing I will mention is, those of you who have participated in the program have constantly heard us say that we traditionally do not work with startup companies. And every so often, a company comes along or a nominator reaches out and says, here's a company you need to make an exception for. You need to have them in your program, you need to see them, and they need you to grow next. Bree is one of those companies, so she will not be speaking from 3 or 5 years of experience, but I think it's something that we saw as an incredible opportunity to learn from Bree and her pitch.
So good afternoon, my name is Bree Jones. I'm so happy to be here. I'm the founder of Parity, and when I was putting together this presentation, I really wanted to focus mostly on the numbers because I know it's a Shark Tank pitch, but I realized that I can't tell the story without first starting with history. And so just with a show of hands, who knows what this is a representation of?
It's called redlining. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's surprising. It's kind of disappointing. About maybe 5% of the people in this room. So it's a map of redlined Baltimore. And what redlining essentially was, it was a federally mandated policy by the US government that essentially required banking institutions, insurance institutions to take maps of major metropolitan cities and determine the racial composition of those neighborhoods. And so for predominantly white neighborhoods, which are highlighted in blue and green, they were considered favorable. And so they were given favorable terms for mortgages, like low interest rates, low down payments, a lot of time to repay your loan. But for neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, they took a red marker and outlined it in red, which is where we get the term redlining, and that essentially meant that banks would not loan or lend into those neighborhoods. So if you were a Black family looking to buy a home, banks essentially would not originate a mortgage with you. Or if there were financing agencies that did, they would give you predatory lending terms. And so this has contributed to what we see today. This is my neighborhood in Baltimore that I'm working in. It's really important to call it what it is, an intentional disinvestment of Black communities. This is not accidental. And this happened across the nation. These are just some other maps of other cities that were redlined. And it's created the wealth disparity, the racial wealth disparity that we've been talking about today. So 72% of white households own their homes compared to just 42% of Black households that own their homes. And home ownership is one of the greatest generators of household wealth. 66%, so about 2/3 of your wealth comes from the equity that you have in your home. And so it's no surprise that white households have a median household income of about $171,000, whereas Black households have just $17,000 in household wealth. And when oftentimes they say that education is the key to ending this, but when you hold for education, white households that have less than a high school degree still have more wealth than Black households with college degrees. And if we stay on this trajectory, the median household wealth for Black families by 2053 will be $0. And so this is why this is so important. So just about my story, I'm from the Bronx, New York originally, BX, born and raised. But my mom, she moved us up to New Rochelle, which is just right above the Bronx because it was one of the last mixed income, mixed race, affordable places where you could raise your kids but also give them a good education. But unfortunately, New Rochelle and the Bronx are now undergoing extreme gentrification. So there's a big developer right now in my neighborhood who is in the process of developing 2,000 luxury rental apartments in our predominantly low-income neighborhood where people are living below the poverty line, and yet these luxury rental apartments are starting at $2,300 a month for a studio. And so for 7 years, I worked on the side as a community organizer and advocate, trying to make things equitable. I had been saving up at the same time to purchase my own house. I decided to use those funds to purchase an abandoned property and convert it into 3 families and preserve affordable housing in my neighborhood. So I used all of my own equity, took out my own construction loans. I acted as my own general contractor, overseeing the permitting and the scheduling, and worked alongside the workers in the house that were helping me with this project to really learn how this is done, because I wanted to continue to preserve affordability in our neighborhoods where so many times we're pushed out. And so I'm really proud to say that I now have 3 families living in this house who are paying below market rate rent just because I decided to not charge them an arm and a leg. It's really that simple. And during that time, I got a lot of bumps and bruises, and it's hard, it looks nice, but there are a lot of things that went wrong in the process. I had also been working on Wall Street. I started my career at Morgan Stanley, went on to work at Point 72 Asset Management, formerly SAC Capital, working in predictive analytics, and then I went on to work in venture capital. Anthemis Group is a small fintech seed and Series A venture capital firm. But all of this combined showed me that there were a couple of things wrong with the industry. Aside from traditional real estate being highly extractive and harmful to communities of color, the real estate development industry has largely missed this amazing opportunity for creating entry-level affordable home ownership opportunities. They focused mostly on rentals. And the second is that home buyers no longer want to live in the suburbs. They want to come back into the inner cities and have walkable experiences. And that distressed communities in the inner city have the most intrinsically valuable housing and land, and yet they're oftentimes overlooked for investment. And when they are targeted for investment, it's oftentimes at a very high human collateral. And so Parity is this is the company I'm founding. It's an equitable development company. I moved down to Baltimore to scale my impact, and I'm working on acquiring several blocks of abandoned properties to rehabilitate and then sell affordably to first-time home buyers, but particularly people who have been excluded from the homeownership process through things like redlining. And so I'm looking today for a $1 million promissory note to acquire 96 abandoned buildings across 10 contiguous blocks and offering investors an 8% annualized preferred return over 8 years. And this is a significantly undervalued transit-oriented development opportunity with significant social impact. So I'm focused in West Baltimore. I don't disclose the neighborhood, but this is the radius. It is just 5 minutes walking to the West Baltimore MARC station, which takes you to Washington, D.C. in under an hour. It is just 3 to 5 minutes driving to downtown Baltimore. Exactly. There is the $2.6 billion Port Covington development happening in South Baltimore, which is being led by the CEO of Under Armour and his real estate development company. There's the University of Maryland, which is a big anchor institution who's continuing to expand westward. And Park Heights is undergoing a $100 million city and state-led development project. So West Baltimore, now is the time. And Kaiser Permanente, also in the room, is expanding its presence in Baltimore. And so I'd really love to talk more with you guys. This is the 10-block area. I chose these 10 blocks strategically, building off of strength. I also live in one of these houses, but I walked house by house and said, okay, this is vacant, matched up with city vacant data, and so there are 96 vacant buildings across these 10 blocks. This is one of the natural assets and beautiful features that if you were anywhere in Brooklyn, New York, the houses in this neighborhood would be going for millions of dollars. Yeah. And this is the block right contiguous to the park. It's actually pretty healthy, mostly homeowners, but when you walk just 2 blocks down, this is what it begins to look like. And so the vision again is to acquire them, rehabilitate them, bring in homeowners who we know inject life into communities, and move forward. So some high-level elements, mostly homeownership. There will be some affordable rentals because we know not everyone is ready to own. Long-term vision is to do some ground new construction, storefronts and retail space, green space, streetscape. So what's really important here is that Parity begins to reverse trends around Black household wealth. So in just 5 years, our buyers will have accumulated $43,000 in household wealth through owning a home. In 10 years, $63,000, and assuming very conservative appreciation values, $200,000 in household wealth over 30 years. That's what owning homes does. And I would love to expand into other cities once we prove our pilot in Baltimore. So just in terms of traction, I moved to Baltimore a year ago, and since then, just my personal network has blossomed. These are 6 people who are now my friends, but who also want to be the first to move into the neighborhood. We really would describe ourselves as part of a demographic that's commonly overlooked as a viable consumer base, but we're really interested in cooperative economics, which spreads and reduces the risk and amplifies our buying power. And we're social justice oriented. We're putting our money where our mouths are, and we want to be in spaces that reflect us and our cultural values. And so the group of us, actually, let me go back really quick. So the group of us texted out, the 6 of us texted out to our friends, hey, is anybody interested to hear what we're working on? If so, come out. We thought we might get 20 people. We ended up getting 100 people who RSVP'd. 60 people showed up, and 52 people are now going through the pre-qualification and pre-approval process. So I'm pre-selling these homes. And so my hope is that if I, just for conversion rate, get 30 people pre-sold just from that initial text message, that's a really strong indication that there is a market opportunity here. And so in terms of how the raise will be used, I'm raising the $1 million, what I'm calling like an equity pool or an equity line of credit that essentially goes to the acquisition of the homes. Then a $1 to $2 million rotating line of construction credit, which goes to the construction of the homes, that produces a livable house. Once that home is sold, because we have the returns and the cost of debt built into it, it goes back into those equity pools so that we can continue to recycle and do the 96 homes over 8 years. And then, but we also are able to distribute to our investors their return on an annual basis, as well as help me pay my student loans. And what's really important here is that the levers for return, or the levers for the margin, is really in keeping our construction costs low, but also the amount of subsidy that we can raise. And that's why I've structured it as a promissory note at a capped 8%, because I don't want to get into the position where I need to be scrambling to either extract more money from the people in the neighborhood or having to beg for more subsidy. It's kind of built in, and the reliance on subsidy will actually decrease over time. And so just in terms of how investors get paid back, so that's the initial investment of $1 million. Again, the annual preferred return. Here, I'm modeling out that you'll get paid back at the end of the 8 years, because that maximizes your total return. And the IRR is 8% and an equity multiple of 1.64%, or X, 1.64X. So that is Parity, and I'll open up to questions.
Wait, you haven't heard the judges yet. Maybe we didn't like it. Come on. Thank you.
I'm getting up too.
Guys. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Don't cry. Don't cry. You did a great job.
Now, before you sit down, pull out your wallet.
Right. Yeah, Bree, you should get the collection bucket out. Stop walking around.
Laughing is good, money is better.
Yeah, Bree, I don't think you're going to have any problem raising your $1 million. You might have just done it here, but I love the spirit that you're bringing into this business plan. It's because of people like you that transformative city change happens. And even if your forecast is 50% off, you're still starting the process and you'll raise more money and pick it up. I mean, this is something that will work one way or the other. Nothing ever works according to formula, but you're a startup and you've got the right idea. So Arcturus focuses on inner cities. We recently committed $22 million to low-income census tracts in Baltimore, and we're doing it in partnership with Able Foundation and Neighborhood Impact Investment Fund. And
Parity.
yes, and our focus is job creation, but in your circle, and I couldn't exactly decide which neighborhood you were in, but right in the middle of the circle on Schroeder, we're working on a grocery store in a food desert across the street from Center West. So these are the types of things that we're working on. I mean, I'd love to learn more about what you're doing and to see if we can be complementary somehow. I think that the question really becomes, if it costs $200 a square foot to build low-income housing, you're not going to be able to recoup that off of rent or unit sales alone. Is there enough LIHTC and philanthropy to be able to make that work? These things are, I mean, you're in an opportunity zone. So there's a lot of money floating around to do opportunity zone investments for these types of projects. But there's always been a financing gap. Opportunity zones and LIHTC didn't solve the gap. There's still more that you need to fill that. So, I think it's promising to see that in that neighborhood there are rents going up to $2,500, $2,800 a month now, and that's frightening too, because the families that have been there for a long time, they're facing gentrification and displacement. So, I think Baltimore has such a long-standing foundation history that there will be a lot of support for what you're doing there. And if you can prove that it works in Baltimore, ICICs in 16 other cities, and there are even more places where you could bring this model. So I applaud you in thinking this through so carefully.
Thank you.
So I am a recovering real estate developer, which I did affordable housing for about 15 years in another life. And so I think the comments are correct. The deals don't naturally sort of work in most cases. So I think how you approach this and the way that you sort of look at, I wouldn't call it extracting, but pulling profits from where you can from each of the stacks. So one quick way is someone, when you get your team together, should just become a real estate broker, right? So at least you can get the broker fees back in to help run the business, and you can get a little piece of that as well as your developer fee. And sometimes those brokerage fees may keep you going while you continue to sort of build the pipeline. I think place is incredibly important, right? I think it's Dave Chappelle who says his parents did just well enough for him to live with poor white folks, and that was enough to sort of put him on a trajectory. And so changing these neighborhoods and the way that you're looking at it and understanding how gentrification works, I think is incredibly important. There is this push and pull of the good work that you do can actually cause the gentrification. And you sort of highlighted that, so you have to sort of think about that, because you don't want to make these communities in isolation or in secrecy, so word will get around and people come in. One of the questions I have is, how do you maintain the affordability, right? So the first family moves in, neighborhood goes gangbusters, and someone walks and knocks on the door and says, I want to give you $600,000 for your house. Now the homeowner said, wow, this is great, I made an investment, and yet that changed the neighborhood. And this is only a phenomenon in poor communities. Anywhere else, that's a real estate deal, right? But in our community, somehow it's looked upon sadly about us sort of doing that. So one question is there something within the deed restrictions or something that maintains affordability over the long term?
Yeah, so we're putting in deed covenants that essentially caps the resale value. So it allows for steady appreciation, but we also recognize that doubling or tripling the value that you originally bought it for in 1 or 2 years actually is not a healthy. It's not healthy for anybody. It's not healthy in Harlem or in Brooklyn. It's not healthy in Baltimore. There's also a little bit of an education piece around so a lot of the homeowners in our neighborhood are elders, and part of me wants them to be able to cash out on their home and maybe go move into an assisted living facility. But another piece is kind of explaining that, look, if you actually just hold on to it and learn from history, learn from what happened in Harlem and Brooklyn, stay in the community, will help you maybe refi so you can get some of the equity out of your home. You'll actually, not only will it benefit you, but it'll benefit the younger generation so that they still have neighborhoods that are affordable to live in. And one thing I didn't talk about here is I'm partnering with the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Services team. So they are attorneys that provide pro bono support to lower income folks. So they're helping us in two ways. One of the things we're concerned about is unlawful eviction. So oftentimes what happens is slumlords have been barely maintaining their properties for years. When they see the neighborhood start to transition, they essentially kick people out, double the rent. So we're working with this pro bono law team to provide legal support to people who are facing unlawful eviction. And then we're also working with existing homeowners to do what's called homesteading of your taxes, which allows you to cap the rate that your property taxes go up, so that when the overall value of the neighborhood goes up and your property value goes up, your property taxes don't go up proportionately. And then we're also working with MVLS around deeds. So helping existing homeowners actually make sure that they're on the deeds to their properties, because oftentimes what happens is your grandma passed on the home to you and you've been living in it, paying the mortgage, but you actually are not on the deed.
Yeah.
And so if you miss a payment or you're behind on your taxes, they can come take your home and you have no recourse. So part of what we do is just around thinking more holistically about how to be intentional developers.
So 2 quick questions, and then I know the others want to have comments as well. 96 homes in 8 years is incredibly slow. Okay. Dynamic markets will happen. There'll be a recession. Something will happen along that line. So somehow seeing that makes me a little nervous, trying to project out that far. And then also I would look to see if there is a land bank or something in Baltimore that could hold those 96 properties for you, clear the taxes, and maintain them, and then you can get them from the land bank in a rate or a chunk that's reasonable for you to turn them around. That would just be my comment.
So, Bree, I thought this was excellent, right? And I think for everybody out in the audience and all the people who participate, I mean, the biggest key to any investment is finding people who like and understand the investment, right? And like Brian said, already it sounds like this is something he does, right? And so real estate, luckily, is one of these investments that a lot of people get. And we get it because it's a building involved. That model you put out, we all can put that on Excel ourselves and play with that ourselves and play with the return. And we all understand how it works, right? And you were very thorough in how you laid it out, right? That Morgan Stanley training looked like it came in handy. You've laid that out real nicely. And so, and the questions will be, and they've been raised, is because we can play with this, we can start to, well, what if the subsidy is 50% of what she thinks? What does that mean to my return? Well, what if the construction cost is 25% higher? What does that mean? And so I would encourage you to scenario some of this stuff, right? So that people can get a sense of, well, how good and bad can it be if things don't go as planned? I mean, one thing, and many of us have been involved in this, it never goes the way you've laid it out. It's either better or worse, right? And just laying out to people what the scenarios might look like. And then the other thing, in addition to selling, if it does successful, because I live in Harlem, I watched that. Luckily, I got there in time. So I got there in '98 while all of that was happening. And I'm very pleased with the way my investment has worked out. But also giving people the ability, like renting, like how are you going to treat that? Because there are a lot of, in Harlem, people have done that. Like they bought into something subsidized, it grew, their family situation changed, they had to move out. So the building restricted renting and forced people to sell because people didn't want the place full of renters. I don't know how you're thinking about that, but that's something else. You gotta, what kind of flexibility you're gonna give people to maintain the value, but at the same time, if their circumstances have changed, they don't want to sell, but they still got to pay the mortgage somehow and need a renting renting opportunity. But I thought this was very good.
Very good.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, so for us, we are also putting in the deed covenant that it has to be an owner-occupied space. And that is because, again, we really want to create homeowners. We know that when there are homeowners in a neighborhood, just neighborhoods do better. But that's for 10 years. And so after the 10th year, if you wanted to rent it out, you could. And there's also a rental component when we convert the homes into 2 families. So it's something that we'd have to work with. But for right now, it is like a very firm line in the sand that I draw that you have to live in the home.
Yep.
Bree, you are an inspiration, thank you.
Thank you.
And you've demonstrated for us the proper marrying of responsible public policy and passion. And I truly appreciate that.
That's right.
Anybody here from Detroit?
Yeah.
Raise your hand. Okay. There's a template for you, okay? And the city of Baltimore is in its rough period right now. But Detroit is an absolute template for you, and I'd ask you to go visit, take advantage of those connections that exist there, and you'll see similar, not the same, but similar kind of enterprises. Do you know the Hamden neighborhood? So I have to ask you the $1 million question. Cafe Hun or Food Market?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't been to either.
You haven't been to either, okay. Well, make it a point to have somebody take you there.
Okay.
My point is that was once a neighborhood that wasn't quite as poorly depicted as you did, but there's an intensive single investment in that neighborhood that really has afforded it to be a thriving entity right now. There's some folks in the audience right now from DC, Menkidi Real Estate Development. Have you talked with them?
Yes, I have.
There are some lessons that they can help you with as well. I'd leave you with a couple of other things. You might consider that there's a financing scheme called New Markets Tax Credits that would absolutely work in a very defined corporate environment, perhaps in partnership with folks like Menkidi or others who already exist, that could absolutely pull this off and pull it off in a much quicker scale than William was suggesting. Too long for too little number of homes, and you might consider that, and I'd be happy to help walk you through that. We happen to be a New Markets Tax Credit provider, although we don't work in the Baltimore or Maryland marketplaces. We'll know some folks who do that. And then lastly, I think you might, lastly, there's a mayoral campaign going on in Baltimore right now. Somehow get some profile and turn this into a campaign issue. And when you do that, you'd be surprised at how many other doors open up for you, because that gap between real cost and what you can sell for exists, and you need to fill it with part of that political process in terms of highlight. Lastly, you might think about taking your personal story, that single experience that you had, and replicating that, using that as a teaching opportunity for others who don't have to wait for a real estate development entity to do it, but be able to singularize it. Each one of those 6 friends that you had, and those 30 people who would like to buy, some portion of them can be profits in their hometown, that they would accept that challenge to do what you did. And all of a sudden that $295,000 in cost to $180 in sale narrows significantly, because like you put sweat, equity, and time into the enterprise. Go, sister, go.
Thank you.
Sorry to leave you short.
No, not at all. Actually, there are so many experts on the stage. I would be remiss if I tried to even come close to that level of guidance. But what I will give you some feedback on is the overall presentation itself. I loved the way that you introduced the history. I think it is apt to comment on the fact that you are pre-revenue, so you can't comment so deeply on the numbers, but you still had a lot of numbers. I would caution you, and it was mentioned earlier, about so many pie-in-the-sky what-if projections. They're great, and it shows clearly how you're going to get the money back for the investor, but it really counts on every variable going your way exactly as you planned it. And so it was said that scenario it out a little bit. You're a visual learner. I would like to see that page that is so jam-packed with numbers, broken out into best case, probable case, maybe worst case, or show me what the risk is here. Because it is so exciting that it's easy to get swept up in it. And I think bringing your investors back to earth to say, look, I get it. I get that nothing ever happens perfectly. So this is what I hope for. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and make that story a little bit more clear. But again, I think you're not going to have any challenges making this come to life. Well, getting your $1 million. I'm sure you'll have plenty of challenges.
And I think you embody the phrase, sometimes the hand we need is at the end of our own arm, that we don't have to wait for others to come into our community and sort of save us, that we can sort of move on our own. And I think that that's incredibly important, because we often are waiting for someone else to save us, some kind of government, some sort of, in Chicago, the Olympics was coming. It was going to save the neighborhood. It didn't happen. Neighborhoods thought they were going to get the Obama library. It went to another neighborhood. And at some point, you've got to stop waiting around and move into action. And so I just applaud you for taking the necessary steps to move forward and create real change.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I almost always agree with Mark on things. I deeply respect his advice and feedback, but there was one piece of horrible advice he said: stay out of the mayor's race. For those of you who've been in ICIC a few years, do not go to City Hall.
We're going to do this old-fashioned way. If you would put your money into Firebrand Artisan Bread, please clap. If your money would go to Invisaware, please clap. And finally, if you were going to put your money into Parity, please clap. And go see Bree. All right, Bree, please stand up. You are our winner this year. Thank you, everybody.